They came to study us the way a scientist studies a specimen through glass, methodically, without warmth, without the expectation of surprise. The Vorath had cataloged 412 species across 9 stellar systems, and not one of them had done what Captain Alara Voss did on day 193 of her transit to Kepler 442b. She fixed the reactor with her grandmother's wrench, not a metaphor. A literal wrench, black-handled, worn smooth where the grip had been gripped 10,000 times before, stamped with the initials RV. On the shank, Ruth Voss, who had rebuilt transmission casings in a garage in rural Saskatchewan, who had told her granddaughter that the difference between a broken thing and a fixed thing was almost always just time and stubbornness. Alara had carried that wrench across 41 light minutes of void in a locker above her bunk. When the secondary pressure coupling on the Horizon's water synthesis module cracked along its seam at 0300 ship time, she pulled it out and got to work. The Vorath sensor array flagged it. The probe they had shadowed the human vessel with for the last 60 days registered the anomaly in the ship's power signature, a shutdown event followed by an unscheduled manual intervention in the spacecraft's core system. They had observed the same event occur on 3 previous occasions with 3 previous probe missions from the human's third planet. In each case, the protocol failure had triggered a return trajectory. The carbon life forms retreated. They always retreated. High Arbiter Sothvel reviewed the data stream from her station aboard the observation platform and noted, without particular interest, that the anomaly was unresolved. The vessel had not changed heading. She flagged it for monitoring and went back to her primary task. On the horizon, Alara Voss lay on her back inside the access crawl space beneath the synthesis module, her headlamp throwing a hard white cone across a tangle of pipes and thermal conduits, and thought about water. Specifically, she thought about what her mission commander back at the Colonial Authority had said to her 3 days before launch. "You understand that this is the thing, Voss. Not the landing. Not the flag, the machine. If the synthesis reactor doesn't work when you get there, everything else is decoration." He'd handed her the mission brief and looked at her the way people look at someone they think might be making the last mistake of their life. She'd taken the brief, said thank you, and gone home to pack her grandmother's wrench. The crack in the coupling was a stress fracture. Micro-vibrations from the ship's rotational ring had worked it over 193 days into something that had become a slow leak. And a slow leak in a sealed fluid synthesis system was the kind of problem that didn't announce itself until the pressure was suddenly and completely gone. She could smell the metallic undertone of vaporized coolant. She could hear, very faintly, the system pressure alarm doing its patient, rhythmic insistence somewhere above her. She worked without hurrying. That was the thing about Alara that the Vorath sensor array could not fully quantify. The human was not in a panic. The biometric readings from their proximity scans, elevated cortisol, increased cardiac rate, mild perspiratory response, were consistent with stress. But the movements were steady, deliberate. There was something almost ritualistic about the way she organized her tools. Something the Vorath behavioral analysis engine struggled to classify. It registered it as procedural comfort response and moved on. It was, though Sothvel would not have had a word for it in her species' 30,000-word lexicon, closer to stubbornness. By 0500, she had isolated the fracture, fabricated a compression sleeve from a spare flange coupling in the equipment locker, and repressurized the system. By 600, she was eating a hydrated meal at the small galley table, the reactor humming solidly behind the bulkhead, the pressure alarm silent. She made a voice log. Day 193. Coupling failure in synthesis module, secondary pressure loop, repaired. No change to course or timeline. I did use about 8 minutes of oxygen I wasn't planning to, so I'm going to have to be a little more careful with my workouts for the next week. She paused. Everything is fine. The last 3 words were not quite a lie and not quite the truth. They were what she told Mission Control, because the alternative, the full, unvarnished weight of what she was doing, alone, 140 million kilometers from anyone who could help her, would not travel well across the delay. By the time her transmission reached the Colonial Authority and a reply came back, whatever had been fine or not fine would have resolved itself one way or another. Telling them everything was fine was not dishonesty. It was a kindness to people who cared about her and couldn't do anything from where they were. She drank her coffee. It tasted the same as it always had, not good but real. The Vorath did not have a concept of coffee. but they had a concept of ritual performance under duress, and their analysis of the human's behavioral patterns over the subsequent 11 days produced a profile they had not encountered in 412 prior species. The carbon life form engaged in physical exertion with no apparent survival purpose. Repetitive movements in the confined exercise module for approximately 40 minutes each morning. It maintained a verbal log directed at no one present, a monologue addressed partly to mission control and partly to what appeared to be itself. It slept 7 hours with a precision that suggested deliberate regulation rather than biological necessity. And twice in that 11-day window it spent approximately an hour simply floating in the observation cupola, looking at the stars, doing nothing, making no log entry, until finally it sighed. The sensors caught the exhale clearly and returned to work. Sothvel found this particularly difficult to categorize. The 412 species the Vorath had observed had operated on recognizable principles: resource acquisition, threat response, reproductive drive, social hierarchy maintenance. The human's behavior in the observation cupola did not fit any of these axes. The creature appeared to be engaging in a form of aesthetic attention, looking at something it could not touch and could not use, not cataloging it, not assessing it, simply looking at it, experiencing it. She flagged this in the behavioral analysis log as non-productive environmental engagement, and after a moment added a secondary notation. Unclear if this constitutes threat-relevant data, she thought about it longer than she should have. On day 211, Mission Control sent a message that arrived in Alara's queue at 0730 ship time. She read it over her coffee, which had not improved. The voice was Marcus Obi, her primary contact at the Colonial Authority, a man she had known for 11 years, who had been at the table when she'd first proposed the synthesis reactor, who had fought for her mission funding 3 separate times, who had learned, somewhere in that decade, to deliver bad news in a tone so measured and warm that it sounded almost like good news until you had heard all of it. Alara, there's no other way to say this. The second wave mission has been delayed. Budget realignment. I know what that means for you, and I'm sorry. The Authority still believes in the project. We still believe in you. Your mission parameters are unchanged, but the follow-up colonist transport that was supposed to arrive at Kepler 42b 18 months after your landing. A pause. It's not coming, not for at least 4 years, possibly longer. You're going to be alone there longer than we planned. He paused again. She had always loved that he left pauses in his transmissions. Most people packed their delay messages dense, words filling all the space as if silence were a waste of bandwidth. Marcus understood that she would need the silence to sit with something before the next thing arrived. I know you said, when you took this mission, that you weren't the kind of person who needed other people. I've always believed you meant that. I still believe it. But I want you to know that I'm here every day, whether you send a message or not. The lights are on. Over. She sat with it for a while. Outside the cupola, the stars were the same stars they had always been. Kepler 442b was a small bright point in the constellation of them, unremarkable from here, distinctive only because she had memorized which one it was. She looked at it. 6 billion people on Earth cheering her on. Marcus in his office at 0300 Earth time, because he'd wanted to be the one to tell her. Her grandmother's wrench in the locker above her bunk. A planet no human being had ever stood on, 40 million kilometers closer every week, waiting to be made livable. She made her voice log. Day 211. Message received from Mission Control. Second wave delay. Noted. She paused. I came here because it needed to be done. That hasn't changed. Another pause. Tell Marcus the coffee is still terrible. She drank it anyway. What happened on day 224 was not in any Vorath strategic model. Their probes had been tracking the human vessel at a distance of approximately 3,000 kilometers, standard observation protocol. The horizon was on course, operating nominally, when the Vorath platform received orders from the High Assembly to transition from observation to assessment. The contact had persisted longer than projected. The human had not turned back. Under Vorath protocol, a colonization-intended vessel that reached the 2/3 transit mark without a voluntary return event was to be classified as a high-commitment transit, the kind of landing that, historically across 412 species, had a non-trivial probability of becoming a self-sustaining presence. Self-sustaining presences required active management. Sothvel reviewed the assessment order and implemented it without question. She had been in the Vorath Survey Service for 31 cycles. She understood what active management meant. The humans' fourth planet, this Kepler 442b they were heading toward, which the Vorath had designated Survey Object 7714, was a marginal but viable terraforming candidate. The Vorath had 3 long-range development plans that included it in their scope. Humanity making a permanent colony there was, from a resource allocation standpoint, a complication. She authorized the first intervention, Pulse. It was not a weapon in the way the humans would have recognized a weapon. It was a precision gravitational disruption, a localized space-time ripple that passed through the Horizon's hull without damaging the structure and interacted specifically with the ship's navigation computer and propulsion calibration array. A soft scramble, non-lethal. The intention was to create a cascade of navigation errors that would force the ship's automated systems to trigger an emergency return trajectory. The pulse fired. The Vorath probe logged confirmation. On the horizon, every screen went dark simultaneously. Alara Voss put down her coffee, looked at the dark screens, and said out loud to no one, "Oh." Well, she pulled her grandmother's wrench out of the locker. The lights came back partially. Life support nominal. Reactor nominal. Propulsion degraded but functional. Navigation computer unresponsive. Alara worked the problem. She was good at working problems. The Colonial Authority had noted in her mission selection dossier, the only mission candidate who had responded to the final psychological stress interview, a simulated total systems failure at 200 days transit, with something that the interview panel had described as calm, methodical engagement. The second-place candidate had also done well, but had, at the 47-minute mark, begun narrating the situation aloud in a voice that suggested they were not entirely confident they were still alone. Alara had not narrated. She had fixed things in order of importance, and at the end of the hour had stood up and asked if there was more. So she worked. She pulled the navigation system's manual override, which was an actual physical lever behind a panel in the floor of the cockpit that no one at the Colonial Authority had actually expected anyone to use, and which had been included in the design specs because Alara had insisted on it in the third engineering review, and the lead designer had humored her. She cross-referenced her last confirmed heading with the ship's inertial measurement unit, which was mechanical rather than electronic and had not been touched by whatever had scrambled the computer systems. And she calculated, by hand, on paper, with a pencil, in a small notebook she kept for exactly this kind of emergency. The correction needed to bring the horizon back to the proper approach vector for Kepler 442b. She made the correction. The ship adjusted. Kepler 442b's small bright star grew imperceptibly, very slightly brighter in the cupola window. She went back to the galley and finished her coffee. The Vorath sensor array registered the event with what would have been, in a biological organism, the functional equivalent of a long, slow blink. The human had not turned back. Sothvel stared at the telemetry for 4 minutes, which was, for a Vorath, a very long time to stare at anything. She ran the data through the analysis engine twice. The results were identical. The vessel was on course. The navigation scramble had not induced a return event. The human had, apparently, bypassed a total navigation computer failure using a physical-mechanical override that should not, by any reasonable probability assessment, have been available on a spacecraft of this class. She pulled up the vessel design files that Vorath intelligence had assembled from monitoring Colonial Authority transmissions. There it was, a manual inertial reference lever included in the specs at the insistence of the mission specialist. A backup to a backup to a backup, the kind of redundancy that most intelligent species in the Vorath's experience abandoned at some point in their technological maturation, because it was inefficient and took up space and assumed a worst-case scenario that was, statistically, unlikely to occur. The humans had kept it. The specific human on this specific vessel had insisted on it. Sothvel added a note to the behavioral file. Subject maintains physical redundant systems for contingencies outside standard probability modeling. She paused, cursor blinking. She added a second note. This is not a coincidence. Cross-reference with coupling repair on day 193 in mission kit inventory. Item, manual mechanical tool. Personal inherited. Non-standard issue. She sat back. The High Assembly wanted a second pulse. She authorized a delay pending further analysis and began, for the first time in 31 cycles of survey work, to feel something that was not quite discomfort and not quite apprehension, but occupied a similar space in her neural architecture. On day 231, Alara found the probe. She had been doing a routine hull inspection via the external camera array, something she did every 10 days, a task that was technically unnecessary given the automated inspection systems, but that she continued because it grounded her. Because walking through the task of looking at the outside of her own ship helped her feel, in some wordless way, less abstract, and she saw it. A small dark form against the dark of space, keeping pace with the horizon at 3,000 kilometers. No running lights, no emissions she could detect, but it was there, and it was following her, and it had been following her, and she should have found it sooner. She made a voice log. Day 231. External inspection flagged a contact at 3,000 clicks. Consistent relative velocity and heading. It's not an asteroid, it's not debris, it's been there a while. She paused. I'm not alone out here. The message took 19 minutes to reach mission control. The response took 19 minutes to come back. Marcus's voice, very steady. Can you confirm it's not one of ours? She confirmed it was not one of theirs. Another 19-minute delay. Another very steady voice. The authority is convening an emergency review. In the meantime, please continue mission protocol. Elara, please be careful. She thought about careful for a moment. Then she thought about what careful meant at 180 million kilometers from the nearest human being, with an alien observer off her port side, and a planet 30 million kilometers ahead that no one had ever set foot on. She made her response. I'm going to keep going, Marcus. This is still the mission. If they wanted to stop me, I think they would have done it differently. They're studying me. She paused. I'm going to let them study. She went to the cupola and looked at the stars. She found the small, dark form at 3,000 kilometers, or rather, found the absence of stars where it sat. She looked at it for a long time. She thought, whatever you are, you've been watching me fix things and eat bad coffee and look at stars for 30 days. You've watched me work. You know I'm not going back, she said, to the empty cupola. Nice night, and went to bed. In the Vorath observation platform, this event was logged as, subject has detected monitoring probe. Subject response, non-hostile, verbal, no course change. Sothvel read it and set the data pad down very carefully. The High Assembly's order for a second intervention pulse arrived 4 hours later. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the behavioral analysis file and read through everything. The coupling repair, the exercise ritual, the observation cupola visits, the coffee that tasted bad but was drunk anyway, the pencil calculation that had restored navigation after a system scramble, the inherited wrench, the voice logs that were addressed partly to mission control and partly to no one, the 3 words, everything is fine, said into a void that could not verify them. She thought about the note she had written, unclear if this constitutes threat-relevant data. She thought about the question underneath that question, the one she had not written down. What kind of creature is this? She authorized the delay for a second time. She wrote a formal dissent memo to the High Assembly. This was something Vorath survey officers were technically permitted to do and practically almost never did, because the High Assembly's orders were not the kind of thing that invited dissent and survived it. She wrote it anyway. She laid out, in the precise bureaucratic language of Vorath Survey Service, an argument that ran approximately like this. The subject vessel represented a class of behavior that fell outside standard response modeling, that the intervention protocol had been designed for species operating within predictable probability matrices, and that applying standard active management to this particular transit risked producing outcomes the model did not anticipate. She recommended continued observation. She sent it. The High Assembly's response took 6 hours. It was 4 words. Confirmed. Third pulse authorized. She sat with that for 19 minutes, which was, coincidentally, the same amount of time it took light to travel from the horizon to Elara Voss's mission control, and then did something she had never done in 31 cycles of survey work. She delayed the pulse again, by 48 hours, on her own authority, and sent a second message to the High Assembly, explaining that she required additional sensor calibration time before implementation. This was technically within her operational discretion. It would not survive scrutiny if anyone looked closely. She sent it, and then opened the real-time feed from the probe, and watched the small human ship moving through the black, toward a planet it had no business reaching, and thought about the word she had not had in any of the Vorath's 30,000-word lexicon. Elara spent the 48 hours doing 3 things. The first was work. The horizon needed ongoing maintenance, and she did it. Seal checks, thermal management adjustments, synthesis module calibration. the 10,000 small tasks that kept a vessel alive in transit. She worked with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, organized, systematic, her grandmother's wrench on the workbench beside her like a talisman. The second was a transmission to Marcus. It was longer than her usual logs. She told him about the probe. She told him about the navigation scramble and the manual override. She told him that she was, in her assessment, not in immediate danger, because whatever was out there had had ample opportunity to destroy the horizon and had chosen not to, which meant either they were prohibited from destruction, or they were, for reasons she could not fully determine, unwilling. She said, "I've been thinking about why we come out here. Not the mission parameters, the real reason. I think we come out here because something in us, whatever that thing is that makes a person stand on a cliff edge looking down, not to jump, but just to know what it feels like to be at the edge of something, that thing doesn't go away. It's not a flaw, it's the whole engine." She paused. "Maybe that's what they're looking at." The third thing she did was sit in the cupola for 2 hours and look at Kepler 42b, which was now close enough that it had resolved from a point of light into a disk. A tiny thing, pale green-brown at this distance, barely distinguishable from the background field, but a disk, a world, real. She pressed her hand against the glass. Nothing lives there, she thought. Nothing has ever died there. But I'm going to bring it to life. On day 247, the third pulse fired. It was calibrated differently from the second, higher amplitude, targeting not the navigation system, but the synthesis reactor itself. The Vorath analysis had determined that the reactor was the mission's single, non-redundant component. Without it, the colonization objective failed regardless of whether the ship reached the planet. There was no manual override for a reactor core interruption. There was no mechanical backup. There was no tool that a single biological organism could wield against a targeted gravitational disruption of that magnitude. This was, Sothvel knew, the end of the transit. On the horizon, Alara felt it as a vibration, a deep, resonant shudder that went through the ship's bones, through the soles of her feet, up her spine, every screen blanked. The reactor alarm, not the soft pressure alarm from day 193, but the hard one, the critical system failure alarm, the red one, came on and stayed on. She looked at it. She breathed. She was, in this moment, alone in the most complete sense a human being could be alone. 200 million kilometers from Earth. 20 million from the planet ahead, with an alien probe off her port side and her reactor dying, and no one who could reach her in time to help. She had known when she took this mission that there would be a moment like this. She had sat with it 100 times in training, in simulation, in her own imagination. She had never, in any of those imaginings, decided it would be okay. She had decided only that it was worth it regardless. She pulled out the notebook, not the navigation notebook, the other one, the one she kept in the chest pocket of her flight suit, the one with the soft cover and the worn spine, half filled with equations and 3/4 filled with other things. Notes mostly. Observations. The coordinates she'd calculated the day she'd first resolved Kepler 442b into a visible disk. A sketch of the cupola window framing the stars. A note from Marcus, transcribed word for word from an early transmission. "You are the kind of person who was made for this. I don't say that lightly." She had never read that note aloud. She read it aloud now, quietly, to the red alarm light and the dying reactor and the alien probe at 3,000 kilometers. Then she closed the notebook, put it back in her chest pocket, and opened the reactor access panel. The synthesis reactor had 3 primary operational modes: automated, manual assisted, and full manual. Full manual was not in the mission documentation as a viable operating procedure. It had been included in the reactor design as a theoretical emergency option, the kind that engineers include, not because they expect it to be used, but because they sleep better knowing it exists. Full manual meant operating the reactor without its computer control layer, managing the hydrogen-oxygen synthesis cycle by direct physical manipulation of the pressure valves, the thermal exchange controls, and the catalytic conversion feed rate. A human being could do it, in theory. The power output would be irregular. The efficiency would be terrible. The operator would need to stand at the panel and work it continuously, and would not be able to do anything else for the remainder of the transit. 20 million kilometers to Kepler 442b. At current velocity, approximately 8 days. She could stand at a panel for 8 days. She had stood at worse things for longer. She took the reactor out of automated mode, disengaged the computer control layer, and began running the synthesis cycle by hand. The Vorath probe's sensors logged the power signature collapse, then the expected silence, and then, after a period of 11 minutes and 42 seconds, an irregular but functional reactor output signature that did not match any standard operating pattern in the Vorath database for human vessel propulsion systems. The vessel was still moving. Sothvel stared at the telemetry and did not for a long time do anything at all. She ran the analysis. The human was running a nuclear synthesis reactor in full manual mode. This was not physically impossible. The Vorath's models did not exclude it. They simply assigned it a probability so low as to be functionally zero, in the same category as a biological organism surviving vacuum exposure or regenerating a severed limb. It was not impossible. It was just not the kind of thing that happened. She called up the physiological data. The human's biometrics over the last 4 days. Elevated stress hormones, yes. Sleep disruption, yes. But the motor function readings, the task performance indicators, the behavioral consistency metrics, all of them showed what they had shown since day one. Steady, deliberate, relentless. Sothvel sat for a long time. Then she picked up her communicator and did something that would, she was aware, end her career in the survey service. Possibly more than that. She opened a direct channel to the horizon. Alara was at the reactor panel when the signal came. She had been there for 14 hours. She had set up a support brace so she could lean against the wall while she worked the controls, and she had rigged a hydration tube so she could drink without stepping away, and she had been running the synthesis cycle in 4-minute intervals with 2-minute adjustment windows, watching the needle gauges she had pulled out of storage because the electronic gauges were still dark. She had found a rhythm. It was not comfortable, but it was sustainable, and sustainable was enough. The signal came through the communications panel as a low-frequency carrier wave outside the colonial authority bands, outside any human band she knew. It resolved into something she could interpret, only because whatever was sending it was doing something very deliberate with the signal structure, modulating it in a way that approximated the mathematical patterns she had used in the reactor calibration she'd transmitted in her day 247 voice log. They had listened to her logs. They had analyzed her mathematical notation. They were using it to speak to her. She let the reactor run on its last interval and stepped to the communications panel. She did not know what to say. She considered several things and then said what was true. I hear you. A pause. Then something that took 3 minutes to assemble itself into meaning through the signal pattern. A complex wave that she decoded slowly. Pencil on paper, cross-referencing the mathematical grammar they'd borrowed from her own transmissions. It resolved into something approximately like, why do you continue? 14 hours at a reactor panel, 8 days to go. A planet 20 million kilometers ahead that no one had ever stood on. 6 billion people at home who had no idea an alien probe was trying to stop her. She thought about what she could say that was true and said it. Because it hasn't killed me yet, and because something needs to be there when the others come. That's what I came to do. She paused. You've been watching me for 30 days. You know I'm not going to stop. 3 minutes of signal processing. Then we know. Another long pause in the signal. Not transmission delay, but what felt unmistakably like thought. Then we did not account for this. She almost laughed. Not bitterly. Almost warmly. She thought about what it would feel like to watch someone fix things for 30 days. With a wrench their grandmother gave them and think, at the end of those 30 days. We did not account for this. She said, nobody ever does. Sothvel did not authorize a fourth pulse. This was an act of insubordination so severe, it had no precedent in the Vorath Survey Service's 11,000-cycle history. The High Assembly sent 3 increasingly urgent communications demanding implementation confirmation. She read each one and did not respond to any of them. She was aware of what this meant for her. She found that she did not particularly care what she cared about. And this was something she would spend a long time afterward trying to understand. This unexpected thing that had developed over 30 days of watching a biological organism maintain itself in the void was what happened next. She watched. She watched the horizon's irregular power signature trace its unsteady way across 8 days of transit. She watched the probe feeds as the small green-brown disk ahead of the vessel grew, day by day, into something that resolved features, landmasses, atmospheric bands, a surface that had never been touched. She watched the biometric readings, which told her that the human was not sleeping more than 3 hours at a time, was eating minimally, was experiencing sustained elevated physiological stress that, in any species the Varath had studied, would have long since produced a behavioral collapse. The human was not collapsing. On day 255, the approach burn sequence engaged. The horizon's trajectory adjusted for orbital insertion. On day 256, the descent module separated. She watched the descent. It was not, from a technical standpoint, a good descent. The reactor power output was fluctuating. The guidance system was running on degraded capability. The landing site the human had selected, a broad plain near the equatorial band chosen months ago, and never updated because the navigation computer was still offline, was marginally acceptable and would have been improved by a more detailed survey approach. None of this, it turned out, mattered. The descent module touched down on Kepler 442b at 1437 ship time, day 256, with a hard landing that was still a landing. The sensors felt it. Vibration, dust, contact, stillness. Sothvell stared at the telemetry. On the surface of a world no human had ever touched, in a suit that had logged 256 days of continuous operation, Captain Alara Voss opened the hatch. She stood at the top of the ramp for 30 seconds before she stepped down. Not from fear. Not from hesitation. The 30 seconds were something else. The same thing she did in the cupola, looking at the stars. The thing the Vorath behavioral analysis engine had logged as non-productive environmental engagement and had never fully explained. She was simply standing at the threshold of something and feeling it, the weight of it, the unbelievable, specific, singular fact of it. Nothing had ever lived here. Nothing had ever died here. She stepped down. The suit's external sensors registered the atmosphere. Thin, cold, trace oxygen not yet breathable, a wind that carried fine particles of rust-red soil. The gravity was slightly lower than Earth standard. Her body registered it as a subtle lightness. The sky was a deep blue-green, utterly unlike any sky she had seen. She knelt and picked up a handful of soil. She held it in her gloved hands, red-brown, granular, bone-dry. She thought about what she had built. In the reactor behind her, the machine that could take this dry, dead soil and run it through a process of compression and catalytic separation and produce, from its hydrogen and oxygen atoms, water. She thought about water. She thought about what water meant. Something lives here now. She set up the synthesis module first. That was the mission. That had always been the mission. Not the flag, not the photographs, not the words. The machine. She worked through the setup sequence with her grandmother's wrench and 6 other tools, following a procedure she had rehearsed 600 times in training and had spent 256 days thinking about. And when the first cycle completed and the output collector showed 11 milliliters of pale, clear liquid, she stood there for a moment and did not move. Water. From nothing. From rock. She made a transmission to mission control. It would reach Marcus in 19 minutes. She kept it short because some things do not survive the addition of words. Marcus. It works. Sothvell's formal removal from command was delivered 14 hours later. She accepted it without comment. She had known it was coming. She had known, when she delayed the 3rd pulse and then failed to authorize the 4th, that she was choosing this outcome deliberately. She was not. She had found, able to make a different choice. The High Assembly's review of her decisions was already underway. Her dissent memos would be examined. Her delay authorizations would be audited. There would be a formal proceeding. The Survey Service would record, in its 11,000 cycle history, the first instance of a survey officer actively choosing not to prevent a colonial-class landing. She did not watch the formal review. She watched the probe feed. On Kepler 442b, the human had set up a temporary habitat and was running the first full-scale synthesis cycle. The output was exactly what the mission specifications had projected. Water from the soil of a dead world. Real, functional, scalable water production that would, if the follow-up missions came. And Sothvell had already sent a private communication to several members of the High Assembly's Scientific Advisory Council, suggesting very strongly that they should become the foundation of something that had never existed before. A second biosphere. A second place in the universe where water flowed and living things might one day grow. She thought about the question the High Assembly had never asked, not because it wasn't relevant, but because it had never seemed like a question worth asking about any of the 412 species they had studied. The question was, what do you do with a creature that crosses 200 million kilometers of void, fixes its own nuclear reactor by hand in the dark, navigates by dead reckoning after a system scramble, runs on 3 hours of sleep and bad coffee for 8 days, and arrives arrives somewhere no one from its species has ever been. And the first thing it does is not plant a flag but kneel in the dirt and start building the machine that will make the place livable for the people who come after. What do you do with that? You watch it, Sothvel thought. You study it. And maybe, and this was the thought that had ended her career and that she found she had no regret about, maybe you get out of its way. On day 261, Alara sat outside her habitat in the Kepler 442b evening and ate a meal she had rehydrated with water she had made from the ground she was sitting on. She made a voice log. Day 261. Synthesis output holding at 40 liters per cycle. Habitat pressure nominal. Systems nominal. The sky here turns a color at sunset that I don't have a word for. Sort of amber green. I've been trying to describe it to Marcus, but I can't. You'd have to see it. She paused. There's a long time ahead alone here before the next mission comes. I know that's hard to think about from where you're sitting. It's hard to think about from here too sometimes. She looked up at the unfamiliar stars, finding them one by one, learning this sky the way she had learned the other one. But I keep thinking about what it's going to look like when they come. When there's more than one of us here. When there are children who grow up and the sky they know is this one. She was quiet for a moment. I think about that a lot. It gets me through the other thinking. She drank the water. It tasted clean. It tasted like nothing, the way real water should. It tasted like the beginning of something. Somewhere above her, at an altitude her sensors could not have detected with her habitat equipment. A Vorath probe that had been ordered to withdraw lingered for 40 more minutes in a low orbit, its instruments still running, its observation still logging. Sothvel, in the formal detention quarters that were her current address pending the Assembly's review, looked at the feed on a personal communicator she had not yet surrendered. She watched the small figure sitting outside a habitat on the surface of a world where nothing had ever lived, eating a meal from water made from stone, watching a sky it had never seen, and thinking about the people who would come after. She held the communicator for a long time. Then she set it down and picked up a pen and began writing. Not a survey report, not a descent memo. Something she had not written before. Something that did not have a name in the Vorath Service's formal documentation library. Though it had a name in theirs, she suspected. The name this strange and stubborn species gave to accounts of things that needed to be told. She wrote, "There is a creature that came from a small planet around an unremarkable star. It travels enormous distances alone in machines it built from its own understanding of physical law. When those machines fail, it repairs them. When it cannot repair them, it bypasses them. When it is frightened, it does not stop. When it is lonely, it keeps going. When it arrives somewhere no one of its kind has ever been, it kneels in the ground and begins to work. We studied 412 species before this one. Not one of them was like this. I do not believe we were right to try to stop it. I do not believe we could have.